Hello, everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Global Health, Chapter 3. I'm Jeremy Whitaker, and let's dive in. So, looking at Chapter 3, it's going to talk about the European settlement of mostly Africa, so empire building. Then it's going to talk about commerce and how that impacts Africa. And then we're going to move into more modern history with some early key programs. Also, on that first page, you're going to notice the concept of problem choice, which is what it sounds like, picking a problem. When you have so many problems in an area and so many things that need addressed, how do you choose given the resources that you have? So starting off with imperialism. So again, you have the countries of Europe who have basically divided the map of Africa. And this causes a lot of problems. So first we'll start off with the Columbian Exchange. And we're talking about Christopher Columbus and him going to the New World. And he took with him to the New World several diseases, most notably smallpox. Now, a native population over there hadn't seen smallpox, didn't have any resistance to smallpox, and it just utterly decimated. In fact, it is estimated that 95% of the native populations of North America were killed by smallpox and other diseases brought by the New World. However, it was a true exchange, and syphilis was actually introduced to the New World. And back then, again, syphilis, new to Europe, used to cause lesions to the bone and kill people in about 2 years. Again, this is before antibiotics. So again, there was a true exchanging of diseases, though North America got the worst of it by far. In fact, there's a story of the Taino Indians who were hundreds of thousands and eliminated within several generations. Of course, Central Africa is where most of this is on, the white man's grave. And again, it's just the idea that Europeans were going down to Central Africa, new diseases, new environments, and they had death rates approaching sometimes at above 50%. So they were just getting decimated, and so it got the name White Man's Grave. So health was really important to go with them as they kind of support the military, support the expansion into these new countries. But again, medicine at this time, 1850s, 1880s, germ theory isn't solid yet. So we haven't, medicine as we know it really doesn't exist. They're just starting to get into modern scientific method in medicine. So again, tropical medicine is born out of this. In fact, schools of tropical medicine still exist in London, and is really their international global health program, but still called tropical medicine because that's where it all began. So you have Koch, who isolated bacteria for tuberculosis and cholera in the 1880s. Again, this is after John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. After that, decades after that, they isolate what actually causes cholera. And of course, there's an interesting story about the really not very effective and terrible American response to cholera outbreak in the Philippines, because again, germ theory is new and these things aren't well understood. Missionary medicine gets a nod, that basically mostly Protestants, because Catholics would always send their own priests and nuns, where Protestants would pretty much send anybody. Again, they're practicing religion and a little bit of medicine, doing the best they could, but had very little training early on. And of course, there's a strong racial bias that runs through this. And that's just the way it was, that there was this perception of white Europeans and their knowledge and their medicine going down to, help the savages and to bring culture and civilization into Africa. So you get that kind of undertone of racial bias throughout the entire time, and just the way it was. So, so commerce leads, of course, to the creation of new agencies. So they talk about the Republic of the Tsetse fly, and the Tsetse fly carries African sleeping sickness. Now, it has to do with cattle routes. So as they're moving cattle across borders, flies like to hang out on cattle, and with them, African sleeping sickness, which is pretty awful, and you can Google that later if you like. And again, the Office of International de Hygiene Publique, again, dealing with cholera on shipping routes, with the Suez Canal, again, cholera being fecal-oral and causing outbreaks. One of the first kind of epidemiological agencies. Of course, John Snow, we've talked about him to death. But again, the first evidence-based epidemiology public, recommendation based on his research. So it's important. Then you have the International Sanitary Bureau over in the Americas, which becomes PEJO. And that, again, is part of when they build the Panama Canal. When the French, on their first attempt to build the Panama Canal, lost most of their people. Most of the Europeans who went over there died. However, a lot of people who were from that side of the world already had resistance to yellow fever, and they didn't die nearly the numbers. The French abandoned their attempt, and then later the Americans went in and, with more public health knowledge, were able to finish the canal. But Peiho was born out of that. And of course, the Rockefeller Foundation, interesting group, good intentions, but again, their focus was on vector control mostly. Ringworm was their specialty, and they even ignored bigger problems because they were really good at ringworm. So then that kind of brings us into World War II, which is the 1930s and 1940s. The Atlantic Charter basically says the U.S. is going to help Britain, but the British Empire has to basically stop. England has to stop with all the colonies, and at that point, most of them get their, independence. Though some did something with it, and many did not. And then the idea of developing nation is actually from this. From the Atlantic Charter, that their goal is to basically help them build democracies, build economies. So, and to this day, developing countries still used. However, the British government, if Parliament has to pass money to help these former colonies out, they didn't have appetite for building infrastructure. So they like short-term, one-off solutions, and so they didn't build, maybe they built a hospital, but they didn't fund it forever. They didn't want to sustain medical systems over time. And so a lot of these countries didn't get the support they needed to kind of start their clinical public health systems. Again, World War II, the UN was born, and the World Health Organization was part of the UN. The Office of Hygiene, Publique, and Peiho were absorbed into that organization. And then shortly thereafter, again, the war ended in the mid-40s, and you had a cholera outbreak in about 47. So right now, this agency is just a couple of year too old. They have their first big outbreak, and they have this first big success, where they kind of coordinate a lot of the communications and response in other governments and make sure the response is proportional. Of course, the malaria eradication program in the 1960s, mixed results, improvements, but eradication. You can't eradicate malaria unless you kill the mosquitoes. You're never going to kill the mosquitoes. So they had some successes, but middling. It wasn't a great program. However, smallpox eradication was, again, one of the biggest public health victories ever, arguably the biggest one ever. And again, it eradicated a disease from the planet, but it was able to do that because it had no animal vector, unlike malaria. Smallpox is only in people. You vaccinate all the people, you eliminate the disease. Don't be wrong, they had to break a lot of eggs to make that omelet, and they had to hold people down against their will and vaccinate them, but they did it. I don't know that something like that could be pulled off today. So that's it for Chapter 3. Basically, again, the colonies started, they ended up folding up, and now they're on their own. And that's where Chapter 4 is going to pick up. So you have 2 discussion boards this week. The first one, you have to track down an article about global health. And then next week, week 4, you'll be, the book mentions that Cuba and Tanzania really ran with Health for All after Alta Alma, and you guys can look that up and see how they're doing. And then the homework assignments, assignment 3, you're going to look up a historical epidemic and just tell us about it. And for assignment 4, you're going to use the CIA fact book and tell us about any country in Africa other than South Africa and how they're doing. Thank you for watching and have a great day.